Hello, I am Kellendir from Kellendir's Corner, and today we are going to be talking about arrows. Now, before we get into the video, content warning. We are going to be talking about exsanguination and how arrows inflict a lot of the damage that they do, and it gets decently graphic. So, if you are faint of heart or stomach, potentially skip this one. Also, second little disclaimer here. I'm not a doctor. Now, I did my research, and realistically, even if I was a doctor, you should still take all of this with a grain of salt, because, well, as much research as you do, arrows back in the day and bows back in the day just were different, made out of different materials with different practices, and even our best attempts to recreate them are not guaranteed to be accurate and correct. So, grain of salt. That being said, let's get into the video. Arrows deal a lot of their damage via the bleeding they inflict. This comes as, or should come as, relatively little surprise to most people. But did you know that a lot of the bleeding that is afflicted upon the victim of the arrow, the arry, a lot of that bleeding is inflicted post-arrow impact. And if the arrow passes completely through the person, doesn't necessarily inflict as much damage. It turns out that when an arrow gets lodged, and we are talking about a medieval war arrow, we're not talking about hunting, we're not talking about target arrows here, we are very much so talking about the equipment that you use for killing other people on the battlefield. When one of these arrows goes and lodges in a person, it wiggles a significant amount, as the arrow has punched through many layers of people meat. Now, your people meat is not meant to be punched through, and it works in layers, and those layers do not articulate in the same way. You have muscles that are moving, and they're not moving in tandem. As they're being pulled, there's also contracting of the muscle. Various layers of flesh slide over each other. There are membranes in the way. All of these things are now pinned through by what is effectively a dowel. And as you move, whether it's because you are flailing around as you have an arrow through you, or because you need to fight on because otherwise you will die and your adrenaline is giving you the boost needed to tear and rip yourself apart, you are causing more and more damage. The arrowhead is moving. In a number of cases, a number of cultural cases that we know of historically, people did not glue their arrowheads on or secure them with anything more than friction because they were entirely fine with the arrowhead just sort of coming loose inside the enemy and getting squelched around with all the spiky blade bits cutting and tearing. That's horrifying. Also, pretty effective, it would seem. So, what is happening? Well, the dowel of the arrowhead isn't easy to break. You may all have seen videos of bows being tested against various substances and the arrows breaking. Well, generally speaking, these bows are pretty powerful. They launch the arrow at a very high speed, and the arrowhead stops so suddenly that deceleration pushes all of the force into the collar, the connection between the arrowhead and the shaft of the arrow, and the shaft of the arrow cannot bear that force, and it explodes or shatters and whatnot. This does not mean that arrow shafts are inherently these very brittle things, and they weren't historically. In many cases, they were made out of ash or other strong, stout woods, and were specifically made so that they could potentially be recovered. Now, a lot of arrows shattered on the battlefield. That's true. We actually know about this. It is more common to recover the arrow head than the actual arrow itself, but arrows were recovered with little enough damage to be used again. These are not weak little dowels that are sticking through you. And even if you break the dowel off inside you, yeah, that's still a problem. You now have wood shards in you as you're moving. That's not fun. That causes extra bleeding. So, the longer the arrow stays there, the more problems we have. The wood of the arrow shaft swells with the blood. Yup, that's a real thing. We know this happens over a long enough period. Horrifyingly enough, there are records of people who have had arrows in them long enough for the arrow shaft to swell to the point where it's something that surgeons note. That sucks. Interestingly enough, not quite the same problem with areas where bamboo arrow shafts are used, but that's we'll go into that another day when we really look at like arrow shaft materials amongst other things. Very cool stuff. Definitely a topic for tomorrow. So, what are we looking at? We're looking at you get hit by an arrow. It sucks. And then it sucks more because this thing continues to wreck you as it remains inside you. So what do? Well, you take it out. That's what you do. You get the arrow out of you and it will stop tearing you up from the inside. But there's some problems here. See, people made these things to be difficult to extract. They oftentimes had barbs on the head, so you couldn't just pull it out. As we already went over, there are a number of historic cases, cultures, where they just would only use friction to secure the arrowhead on. As the arrow travels through the air, it's not like the head's going to just fall off as it's flying forwards. Not like it's going to fall off as it sinks through the person. Once it's inside the person, what do you care? What do you care if it falls off? Like, that's good. It traps the arrowhead in there. A sharp, often barbed, little flanged, horrible thing that is now in the person's body. They move, it rips them up. There are people who survived with these things in them. There are accounts of pains years and years after, because duh. I honestly, I did not get into the weeds with that particular series of research topics because partially there isn't necessarily great evidence. Like, obviously the medical technology at the time is not such that we have detailed accounts of what's actually going on there and how much would we even believe, right? There's a lot of problems with that. However, there's enough people saying it happened historically that it's not an unreasonable or a weird thing. And we know in some cases things like this happen. It definitely happens with lots of bullets, but bullets aren't the same as an arrowhead, so real differences there. So I'm not going to get into that one in particular because I don't know enough to adjudicate well there. However, continuing on, the arrow is going to deal damage until it is removed. Removing the arrow is hard. Removing the arrow is often intentionally hard. Generally speaking, we often hear in fantasy stories or in movies, right? You break the arrow shaft and pull it out, or you push it through. These are actually both historically real things. These are surgical techniques that people use to extract arrows. But we often don't give them the justice they deserve when it comes to the horror of these tasks. If you have an arrow fired from a war-weight bow, the arrow shaft is like your thumb. Maybe not your thumb. My thumb is a pretty good size indicator for the arrow shaft for a very powerful bow. Yeah, that's not easy to just snap. You sometimes sawed these things off, and this was not pleasant for the person with the arrow in them. You saw the shaft off, and then you can pull it through. Great. That solves the problem. Now, if you can stop the bleeding, awesome. If the arrow shaft is in them and the arrowhead hasn't come out the other side, well, you need to remedy that. Or chance leaving it in and see if they live. We're dealing with medieval medicine. These are some of the grim realities here. You can push it through and hope that you don't punch through any critical structures of the body. That's a horrifying process. You literally have to you have to finish the arrow's journey through the person, then cut it off, then pull it out, then try and keep them alive. Yeah, not fun. Alternatively, you just hope they deal with it and pull the arrow shaft out. If they did decide to secure the arrowhead to the arrow shaft, you probably can't pull the arrow shaft out. You can't just leave it in there either. Yeah, the wood will degrade over time, not in a time frame that is really survivable by the person. These are terrible options, and I don't think we really go over them enough in our fantasy settings. We really need to respect the damage that an arrow does after it strikes a person. And it should not be an easy thing to clean up. This should be complicated. This should be painful. This should be consequential. So, we've gone over what the arrows do. How do we implement this? Well, when we look at novels, interestingly enough, this is both the most complex and the least complex of the scenarios here. It is the most complex because, generally speaking, whatever level of detail you go into here, you want to kind of make things accurate. But fortunately, we actually have a number of really good resources to aid us. If you are a novelist and you're looking at the problems facing people when arrows get lodged into them, we actually have really good historic accounts of a number of operations to remove arrows from a whole bunch of different time periods. We actually have some really good ones from effectively the last of the Judean rebellions against Rome. So my ancestors, the last of the Jewish revolts, well, the last couple, have a number of sieges. Everybody talks about Masada. It's the one that gets all the attention. There were lots of others. It's a very interesting time period, and there's tons and tons of ambush attacks by these various Judean rebel groups. And this results in lots of arrow casualties. And we actually have some pretty good documents about what happened here. And other Roman documentation also provides us a decent look into how they tried to take care of people struck by arrows at that time period. That's a great place to look if you're going for your classics. If not, if you're a more medieval fantasy, well, oh my goodness, let me refer you to the War of the Roses. I know you might think the 100 Years' War, but actually, some of the best medical accounts for arrow extraction come from the War of the Roses, because we have longbowmen against longbowmen. We have longbowmen on both sides, arrows going everywhere, tons of people of many different ranks getting hit by arrows in a culture relatively used to mass archery. Wonderful accounts from lords, from a king, all sorts of great stuff, and some very inventive surgeries too for the medieval period. So I would highly recommend, if you're an author, those are two great places to go. There are also some Japanese accounts, interestingly enough, and they have some beautiful arrowheads, which we are going to go over in a separate video about the parts and components of an arrow, because some of the Japanese arrowheads literally look like something out of a fantasy novel already. You don't need to do anything to them. And these are actually historic, so some really cool stuff there. Cool. We've got novels mostly covered, and really, as a lot of these things, it means go to the library, look up a historic account, base it off of that, which is pretty standard stuff, realistically speaking. But I've given you a couple of areas that you can go, so sort of narrowed down the search for you. Now let's get into computer games, right? Well, dot damage. I don't see nearly enough of this reflected in arrows. Generally speaking, it's an archer and you get, oh yes, here's your barbed arrow that bleeds your foe. Okay, well, most of your arrows should do this. And realistically, you can even put stacking debuffs on a target as they get hit by arrows. We'll go into that in another video. That's arguably even more horrifying, but we'll talk about that later. You should have stacking bleeds. The arrows, as they slam into a target and as the target continues to move and fight, produce more and more bleeding and promote just a horrible, exsanguinating death. that's something that we really should be looking at and expecting to see in our video games. And it's a cool thing. It's an extra mechanic for archers. It's a really nifty way to balance out immediate damage versus long-term reward, like having arrows in people. Maybe they get to deal with the arrows at a certain point. Maybe there's healing magic that dissolves or liquefies the arrow or whatnot. And so, the arrows only persist for so long in certain targets. There's tons of mechanics here begging to be explored and discovered, and it's relatively rarely that I see a game actually do this justice. Because most arrows don't actually deal a ton of their damage up front. Unless you hit a critical structure in the body, heart, lungs, even the lungs doesn't necessarily work too quickly, the person still is up and about for a while. This is not a machine gun. It's not going to saw through somebody effectively. And now let's turn to pen and paper role-playing games, because here we have glorious opportunities. When we look at something like Dungeons & Dragons, which is, generally speaking, because it's so popular, it's what I refer to the most often, we get beautiful examples of what you can do. One that I personally like, that I've implemented in many of my games, and I think I thought it up, I did think it up, but other people may have thought up similar systems, and so there may be effectively convergent evolution going on here. Convergent pen and paper evolution. But each arrow inflicts a bleed. First arrow thunks into the target. Well, that's a d4 each round. Okay, that's fine. Just a little tink of damage. Cool. Second arrow, it's now a d6. Okay, that's a little bit more. Third arrow, right? D8. And we continue to upgrade the die size. And this really lends itself to that feel of sticking the arrows into the target and just exacerbating a cascading bleed on them, where you are dealing more and more damage per turn, and you can get it up to some point where, it's a d12, okay, let's go to 2d6, because 2d6 is a bit better than a d12, let's go to, right, more than that, right, you can just keep on scaling this however much you want, and set the scaling pace, so it builds faster and faster the more arrows are in a target. And what can we do? Well, make healing extract some of the arrows. This is magical healing. This isn't natural healing. We can actually have this healing be able to push an arrow out of the body. Probably painfully, right? It shouldn't be pleasant, but this can happen. It's a fantasy world. We're dealing with healing magic. You heal the person, maybe it downgrades the bleed by 1 or 2, or maybe you have them roll a die to see how many stacks of the bleed it takes away. So archers are trying to increase the exsanguination of the target, and healers are trying to go and keep the arrows out of their charges. And this is just one more level that a battle can be fought on in Dungeons & Dragons, which can be very cool. This also allows some really cool things for the party to do. Tag a creature with a bunch of arrows that is going to have a hard time removing the arrows itself. Maybe it doesn't have opposable thumbs. And have it bleed, right? Maybe you track it by the bleeding, like people do when they hunt in real life. There's all sorts of really cool things that we can do here. I personally like the escalating bleed idea. What I do in my D&D campaigns is I almost always give my rangers and my other characters who choose to specialize in bows, I give them a limited number of arrows to reflect what you might actually carry in a quiver. But I make the arrows much stronger by giving them these bleed traits and allowing them to have, special choice of arrowheads, much in the way that a spellcaster goes and arranges their spells as they will for the day. I go and I allow this person to divide their 16 arrows amongst a number of different types of arrows, and maybe they gain special arrows as they level, as I've done in a number of cases. So it makes them a little bit more involved. It solves some of the problems of, Rangers in 5e kind of really being bad. And it gives them a very powerful tool. It also incentivizes hitting. Every arrow that misses is a lost chance to stack up more of that glorious, glorious bleed. This is a really cool way to go about things, and also allows you as the dungeon master to pressure players. A bunch of enemy archers go, thunk 3 arrows into a player character, d6, right, d4, d6, d8, now it's a d8 each turn. That's something that they need to worry about. And players are oftentimes loath to use healing items or burn spells on healing. This is a good way to counter that and to get your players to feel a little bit more of that threat as the ominous bleed keeps on ticking. Are they going to loose more arrows into that player the next round? Are they going to set the bleed to a point where we're really going to have to struggle to keep this person alive? There's some really glorious, tense moments that you can achieve that way. But that is just one suggestion, and this can be handled in many other ways. So, until next time, until next arrow video, try not to die of exsanguination. It doesn't sound terribly great, especially not arrow-based exsanguination. But beyond that, I, as always, would like you to be kind and clever and not cruel, and hopefully your day is treating you wonderfully, and may you have just an absolutely wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.